Okay. Birmingham, okay. We're glad you're here and hope you're making the most of the beautiful weather because it's not going to last. I think Friday we're going to have storms move back in, but that's kind of synonymous with the spring. So, hope you've had a good first part of the week. This is the half of this are the announcements. The bottom half are people on our prayer list. So bear with me. They're all important, and we want to make sure that you're caught up. A couple of these are just reminders. Our first Vacation Bible School workday will be this Sunday, 3 to 5, down in the education wing of on the bottom floor there. And Katie is already getting stuff together for that. So this, of course, if you miss this one, don't despair. There will be others. So, but we need to get that off on a good start this coming Sunday, 3 to 5, there in the education wing. Don't forget about the adjustments in our schedule on Easter Sunday. Our worship service, of course, will begin at 9:30, but there will be no Bible classes that day or evening programs that night. So keep that in mind. Ladies, don't forget about the coffee gathering, coffee meeting this coming Saturday. Excuse me, nope, not this Saturday, but Saturday week, March the 30th, 9 o'clock at Starbucks. So remember that. All children ages 0 through 5th grade are invited to an Easter party and egg hunt on March the 30th from 1 to 3 here at the building. And they'll have snacks and games, and hopefully the weather will allow them to hunt eggs out here in the courtyard, unlike last year where we hit them all over the building. And they, bless their hearts, they looked as hard as they could, but I was still finding eggs around the 4th of July. So thankfully they were plastic. They were not the real ones. So when the kids were little, I invariably found them in the yard with the lawnmower. That wasn't good because it was usually June when I found them. But anyway, that'll be coming up on that Saturday the 30th. Arab Church of Christ will hold their 31st annual singing. That's this Friday. Nope, that's Friday week 2 on the 29th. Boy, all these are 2 weeks ago. Why am I announcing these? But anyway, singing on the 29th, 7 o'clock. So we'll have ample opportunity to update you on a lot of these. As far as our prayer list, some major changes from when we were together this past Sunday. Bonnie Mara's back procedure has been postponed till this Friday. So hopefully she'll be able to have that. Jeanette Mara had a radiation treatment yesterday. She'll have another one. It was, so you won't have the other one tomorrow then. Right. They were going to do them back to back. Okay. All right. She was scheduled for one yesterday and tomorrow, but she ended up having it today, and then another one tomorrow, and then 2 next week. So continue to remember her. Little Lucas Estes, this is Roy Sanderson's great nephew, is back in the hospital in Birmingham. Correct, Roy? So just continue to remember him. Bobby Hayden met with the surgeon yesterday. He is scheduled for double bypass surgery on April the 3rd. So make a note of that on that Wednesday. He'll undergo double bypass. Harvey Poss was taken to the ER this past Sunday, and he was able to come home, but is still quite weak. So remember him. Harriet Lang had a pacemaker put in Sunday night there at South Baldwin Hospital in Foley, and she's home back in Gulf Shores recovering from that, so but continue to remember her. Lindsay Reed, this is a niece of Anthony Campbell, was involved in a car accident this morning. She was scheduled for a C-section Friday, but obviously they moved that up to today. She and the baby were both in stable condition following the accident. So we'll continue to try to monitor that situation and update you on their progress this Sunday. Mike Penn, this is Candy Enlow's father, had some issues with some previous little heart issues, but there's no blockage that will require surgery. They're going to try to treat this with medication at this time. So continue to remember him. We express our sympathy to Jana Kinnemer in the passing of her stepfather, Mr. Farrell Noblet, passed away this past weekend. A private service will be held at a later date, but continue to remember Jana and her mom and that entire family in your prayers. Are there any others? I'm almost hesitant to ask because we went a couple of weeks and just very limited situations going on, but it obviously has changed. Let's bow. Father, in the quietness and the comfort of our gathering tonight, we begin our time together thanking you for being the God of all comfort, for loving us and for continually reminding us of your power as it's expressed on so many levels. We see it in the changing of the seasons, and we see it in the lives of people that we care very deeply about. And we're very mindful tonight, Father, of all of these that we've mentioned. There are those that are currently in the hospitals, and we pray for them. There are still others who are waiting for procedures and surgeries. And as we were informing each other, we know, Father, that you're already involved in these situations, and we just pray that they would sense your presence in every one of these. We're very mindful tonight, Father, of Jana and her entire family, and may they sense your peace and comfort that goes far beyond what human capabilities are able to do. We're mindful, Father, of those who are traveling during the very busy time of the spring, and we pray for everyone's safety and that they would be able to arrive at their appointed places without incident. We thank you for your word, for the opportunity that we have to study it, but we pray, Father, that it would go beyond just reading and acknowledgement on the page, that it would be taken into our hearts and lived out day in and day out. All these things, Father, we ask in your Son's name. Amen. Okay, we're back in John chapter 19. We had a guest speaker last week. Very informative presentation on generally the work, of course, in that part of West Africa, and more specifically, the work with the Christian school there in Benin. And so we were thrilled to be on the receiving end of that information. In fact, we've had some follow-up questions and people wanting to help in a direct way. And Frank Wood mentioned a while ago, and I'd forgotten about this, but I think it's well worth it. I'm going to email Richard England, and he mentioned how preachers travel around and people travel around on the motorcycles, and we're going to get Richard to find us a picture of the family of 5 and the goat on the motorcycle. That's we've got to lay eyes on that. So trust me, if I get it, you'll get it. I'll find a way. I don't know how I would work that in on a sermon Sunday, but I'll find a way. We'll have it as a part of the PowerPoint in that regard. Well, going back a couple of weeks, here in chapter 19, we were looking and here again, I would encourage you, and as we've done this throughout this entire study, that because of the unique nature of John's gospel, you do, of necessity, have to do some comparative reading in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because obviously you're going to get things in all of them that maybe the other does not. And I would recommend, I've got to look and see if it is even still in print. I ran across it the other day, but the book is entitled A Harmony of the Gospels, and if it's still in print, James, I don't know, but you can go through the ministry of Jesus, and each page will have at least 3, sometimes 4 columns comparing, where that incident or that miracle or that is recorded in all 4, and you can read all 4 of them right there. I'm guessing there's probably a software or a website that will do that, but I don't know anything about that. I like to have a book, and I'm reminded all the time about how technically limited I am, and I'm good with that. I'm okay. I'm still alive. I can function without knowing a lot of these things, and I can assure you, if I still had a VCR, it would be blinking 12. And if I could get my phone to blink 12, I would get it too. But anyway, it's a great book, and I know I've got one. But like I said, in all seriousness, you can pull up Bible Gateway or some of these others and do comparative. But I think that's essential, because John has his own approach. And if you remember, near the end of the gospel, John does put forth kind of a disclaimer. And he makes the point in John 20 that many other signs that Jesus do in the presence of his disciples that not in here. But these 7, 8 if you count the resurrection. These are that you might believe. We were talking about the series of 7s in John's gospel, the 7 miracles, the 7 I am statements. And then we noted, whether it was intentional or not, I tend to think that it is, that in chapter 18 and 19, John records 7 scenes during the trial of Jesus. And it starts, if you remember, it goes all the way back to the house of Caiaphas, back in verse 28 of chapter 18. That's scene 1. And then verse 33 is scene 2, because that's when they take him to the auditorium to see Pilate. The third scene is when, the second scene, of course, is when he brings Jesus inside his house. The third scene is in verse 38, when he goes back out to the Jewish leaders. Fourth scene, beginning verse 1 of chapter 19, is the scourging. Took Jesus and scourged him. The fifth one is when verse 3, they brings him back out, verse 4, I'm sorry, and he brings Jesus back out. We noted the sixth one, verse 8, when he takes Jesus back into the interior part of his palace, where the Jewish leaders would not go, because that would make them unclean. And of course, this is the context of when he goes back in, and he makes that infamous statement, don't you know that I have the power to release you and the power to crucify you? And then that answer, Jesus finally, again, very limited in John's gospel. You go back to the second scene where Jesus, lets him know my kingdom is not of this world. And then, of course, I'm a king, but not in the way that you think I am. And so Pilate seems to be at least has an understanding of that, which I find rather interesting, because he's been saying this for 3 years, and a lot of his disciples that have been with him all that time, they still can't get it. And yet Jesus tells Pilate, a pagan Roman governor, hey, my kingdom is not of this world. If it was, then what? My followers would fight. And Pilate goes, okay. he accepts that, which is rather ironic because he couldn't get some of his closest followers for it to really register with them. Not at this point. So Pilate says, "Look, you don't realize that the level of power that I have." And then this is what Jesus said: "You would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above." We talked about that Sunday, right? Romans 13, verse 1. And even Pilate was to be considered, if what Paul says in Romans 13, he was there under God's direction. And then that last statement, "Therefore he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Now that's not talking about Judas. Who's it talking about? Caiaphas, yeah. Talking about the Jewish high priest. He has the greater sin. So with that, verse 12 then ushers us into the seventh and final scene with Pilate. And keep in mind what we said a couple of weeks ago. What we know, it's extra biblical, but it's not necessarily anti-biblical in that regard. As far as Pilate's background, he married into the emperor's family by marrying his niece, and has somewhat of a very tumultuous position there as governor of Judea. Normally, he stays in Caesarea. It's where he wants to stay. Bigger Roman garrison there. It's kind of right there on the coast, whereas he has to go to Jerusalem during the feasts to kind of appease the Jewish leaders and to kind of be a presence there. And he goes, and then this gets dumped in his lap, and he tries any number of ways to get out from under it. He sends him to Herod. That does no good. He offers up Barabbas, and thinking they'll certainly choose to release Jesus. That doesn't work. And so he's utilized, he has him scourged. And behold the man, John is very clear to point out. And, that didn't sway him. That was back up there in verse 5. And I kind of make a notation with that one because it's going to change. I don't know that we can put too much emphasis on verse 12. Upon this, Pilate sought to release him. I was reading a commentary on this earlier in the week, and it was almost like, and if you've seen the dramas on television or even documentaries where a judge will rule on a case and he'll say insufficient evidence, the state has failed to prove their case, and then he would bang the gavel and say what? Case dismissed. That's how close Pilate is to doing this. Now, he doesn't have a gavel in his hands, but he is this close. I mean, John says, upon this, upon what? This is the antecedent to what? That statement. There's something about Jesus' presence there that, it happened back earlier when Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, then would my followers fight." And now Jesus said, yeah, you're in this position because somebody else put you there. Hey.
I think one thing to note about this is, John's making the case, I think, that people need to understand that an impact, not an impartial, but an impassionate judge heard all the evidence and said he's innocent.
Right.
And
yep.
That's really important. That's foundational to the gospel message, is that this man was chosen by God.
Right.
He was the anointed one. And if he was actually guilty of the crime, how could he be our Savior?
Right. And here again, that kind of fold, and it's, I've gotten not too involved, but I'm so heavily steeped right now in this this series on Romans on Sunday. And by the way, we're not through with it yet, just so you'll know. We're going to be there Sunday. but that he lays that out, Paul lays that out in chapter 3, that the only way this could take place is if Jesus was completely innocent. The only way he could take on our unrighteousness and we in turn take on his righteousness was if he was innocent. And to your point, that's exactly what he makes, he makes very, very clear. So upon that statement, Pilate's ready to dismiss the case, and then the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king sets himself against Caesar." Now, true or false? Yeah, pretty true. There was no king at that time except Caesar. The Herods, Luke references Herod as a king in the book of Acts, but it was a dynastic name, and he was still a regional ruler, just kind of in collaboration with the Roman government. What's unique about this is, and I have yet to come across a translation that capitalizes the word friend. What's interesting about this is, undoubtedly, that term, Caesar's friend, was a title. It was something that a person was granted based on their service, based on their relationship with the emperor. And if you earned enough of his merit, if you earned enough of his attention, then you were given the accolade as Caesar's friend. But it was a closely guarded one. And it's unfortunate that our translations none of them capitalize the word friend there, because it would kind of tip us off that there's more than just saying, "Oh, well, the Caesar and I are good buddies." No, as I said, he was his wife's uncle, and there's some discussion about how he ended up in Palestine or Judea, but he readily wants to get out of there because it wasn't the most favorable of positions to have. And so whatever he did to acquire this title, Caesar's friend, now that's in jeopardy, because no one would argue the fact that the man claimed to be a king. And so they said, okay, I mean that's pretty straightforward, because look at the complete reversal. Verse 12, he's that close, but then verse 13, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, and in Hebrew, Gabbatha. All right. We now get further confirmation that, how can I put this delicately? Pilate has the backbone of a gummy bear. All right? No character, nothing, because he can be swayed just that quickly. Notice what sways him is not additional evidence, a last-minute witness. No, what swayed him was what? Loss of power and position. So they leave the there at the Praetorium, and now he makes his way out to the judgment seat. It was right there by the fortress of Antonio. Archaeologists, by the way, believe they have uncovered that. They have discovered where the bema or the judgment seat would have been. And this was not uncommon for the ruler, for Pilate, to go, and it's like like a judge getting behind the big desk in the black robe and everything. So that's what he's doing here. He goes up to the judgment seat, and John tells us it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. Now, just for not confusion, but just for further study's sake, if John is following Jewish time, when is the 6th hour? Noon, all right? Here's the issue. not really an issue, but here's the interesting, that you read Mark's gospel, chapter 15, Mark tells us it was the third hour. And of course, scholars have tried to decide, okay, was it anything? Well, that's not really that big a deal. Well, it is and it isn't. Mark says it was 9 o'clock in the morning. John says it was noon. And what further solidifies, the reason for that is extra biblical, or even go back to the Old Testament. The sixth hour was when the sacrifices were to be slain for the Passover at the temple. And by the way, and it's not because I'm certainly not a cynic or anything, but I was just down there at Walgreens and saw it, and I wanted to pick up the card and go, this is not right. Wrong. But you watch a lot of Easter cards and stuff, and it'll have a lamb on the card, and it's little old bitty, maybe less than a month old, and we think about the thought of killing something like that. Well, but here's the problem. The problem with that is what? Nobody knows. Sure you do. Do it. Lambs had to be a year old for the Passover feast. So they were not these little bitty cute little woolly things that were going to be. No, they were, big old smelly sheep that they were less than, they were still referenced as lambs, but they were, pretty good size. So they had to be at least a year old. Okay, now that I've totally messed up your Easter idea, but it does. I mean, I think it's worth noting. So does John say sixth hour so it would coincide with when the sacrifices were killed at the temple? Or there's another prevailing thought that no, John was following Roman time here. And Roman time began when? Yeah, started at midnight. Yeah. So the sixth hour would be 6 o'clock in the morning. So that's a little bit closer. The problem, the issue is, okay, if John is on Jewish time, and Jesus is going to die at when? The ninth hour. So there's only 3 hours from this to go down the streets of Jerusalem. So is that possible? It's possible, but there could be some other explanation. I'm just throwing that out there. I don't think Mark and John are in conflict with each other. They may just be approaching it from a different timeline. Okay? So if you're doing comparative reading, you're going to run across that in Mark 15. Mark said it was the third hour. John said it was the sixth. So he's there at the judgment seat, and he said to the Jews, he being Pilate, and notice the difference. Back up in verse 5 of when he brought him out post-scourging, he references him as, behold the man. Now, verse 14, he has him standing there, and he makes the declaration. He says to the Jews, behold your king. Now, I don't know if there's any way for any of us to read that or verbalize that with the sarcasm and the just the sheer ridicule that would have been in it. This is not an affirmation of faith on Pilate's part. He's placating to whom? He's placating to the Jews. He's got, okay, they're going to, destroy my entire career. In fact, what's interesting about this is, it's not in John's gospel, but one of the synoptics mentions that after this, Herod and Pilate were arch enemies. But after this, what? They were pretty good buddies after that, which is interesting, to say the least. So, behold the king, they cried out, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? Again, the sarcasm and the ridicule. He's already passed judgment on him. He's not asking them that like, are you sure you want me to do this? He's already passed judgment. He's in the judgment seat. And then the chief priest made that unbelievable statement. What is inferred when they say, we have no king but Caesar? They have in one moment taken God off the throne. They didn't believe in Jesus, but their own law taught the sovereignty and the supremacy of the covenant God, of Yahweh. And to say we have no king but Caesar. So they have in one statement, they've taken the sovereign God completely off the throne. And you could say, if later on they kind of say, well, we didn't really mean it. Oh, no. You go back again to the synoptics. They were so locked in on crucifying him. The other prophetic statement that they made had to do with what? Let his blood be where? Upon us and on our and buddy, was it ever. Fast forward 35 years. 68. Second Temple Rebellion. And yeah, Rome comes in again, only this time it's not to crucify one man. It's to destroy the temple, it's to level the city and totally suppress. And at that point, after 70 AD, the Jewish nation, for all practical purposes, vanishes. How long before Rome collapses? Well, let's see. Constantine will come in probably 3rd century.
375.
Yeah, 375, and then it was. But they'll kind of hang on. What happens if you'll look at a map of the Roman Empire, and then with each century, probably till about the 5th, it continues to shrink. And what's interesting about that is you go back and read the book of Revelation, and the visions that John has about the Parthians, the army from the east that invaded, and it all fits. And the Goths, yes, thank you. The Parthians and the Goths. It's not the Chinese and the Russians. Sorry. The army from the east there were the Goths and the Parthians.
It's interesting that the last piece of evidence here in this text, the last testimony is we have no king but Caesar.
Yeah.
So it's not just Jesus is innocent; it is that these Jewish leaders aren't believers.
Exactly. What's interesting about that is, you're right. As far as John's gospel is concerned, this is the last proclamation that they make. Fast forward over to the book of Acts. Acts, and you were just there on Sunday morning, and Acts 3 and Acts 4, where they're same group, they're interacting with the apostles, and it's almost like they're still trying to hold on to their religious influence, when really, you think about the mob of people who they hear their spiritual leaders say that. How are you going to follow them after this? Doesn't matter whether you believe that Jesus was guilty or innocent. That's irrelevant as far as it. You hear your spiritual leaders say Caesar. There would be, 35 years later, there would be maybe people in this same group who would be executed because they refused to say that. Here's the question. They make that statement here. Fast forward to 68 when they bring in an image of the emperor and put it up in the temple. Why'd they go crazy over that? I mean, they just said what? We have no king but Caesar. So 35 years later, they come in, they put an image of the emperor in the temple, and they just lose their mind. Interesting. So then, verse 16, he handed them over to them to be crucified. Now, you got to be careful with the them here. He's not talking about the Jewish leaders. He's talking about the soldiers, right? John is very clear. There are some Jewish scholars who have a real tough time with John's gospel on any number of fronts, not the least of which is they accuse him of being anti-Semitic in his presentation. But he's very clear to point out the Jews did not carry out the execution. It was, in fact, Rome. It was Roman authorities. And so Pilate then hands, and by the way, if your class is somewhat on schedule, this coming Sunday, we're going to be talking about Stephen. And we know in chapter 7 what happens to him, right? The issue is the Jewish leaders not only wanted Rome to carry out the execution of Jesus so they would save face, but the other reason was what? They didn't have the authority. They didn't have the authority to execute him. And so what happens to Stephen, there's an interesting parallel, and if you have time to study this between now and Sunday, there's an interesting parallel as to what happens to Jesus and what happened to Stephen. But there's that difference, of course. What Stephen is dragged out of the Sanhedrin hall and drug outside the gates of the city, and he's basically lynched. He's stoned to death there. And yet, bottom line is they didn't have the authority to do that. So they took Jesus, verse 17, bearing his own cross to the place called the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. And many of you that have been to Israel have been taken to a spot that probably, I think there's a high probability that this is right. Constantine built a church on that spot and on that site, because even by the 4th century, they were pretty well convinced this is where it was. And it was called that because the outcropping of rocks did resemble a human skull. And so that's probably the case. You know that crucifixion was not anything new to Jewish culture. Especially in the region of Galilee, where Jesus grew up. He was very familiar with crucifixion. During the Intertestament period, Alexander Jannaeus, who was the high priest of all things, crucified 800 at one time in Jerusalem. He crucified 800 Pharisees at one time. It was also during a big feast. I mean, that's your entertainment for your feast, is crucifying 800 Pharisees. Crucifixion can be traced back to the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were one of the first ones to practice this. It was later carried on by the Assyrians, the Persians, but it was Rome who perfected it from the standpoint as a means of first torture. And there were 3 components. There was shame, there was torture, and then, of course, there was ultimately death. And the shame of it, of course, was the ridicule that the victim had to endure. The torture, obviously, with And I did a little extra reading on that earlier in the week. And of course, we're familiar with the nails that are either put through the hands or through the wrist and across the feet. The victim would sit on a peg. They would rest on a peg there, and that was to keep all the weight from being pressed down on the places in the ankles and on the arms. Additionally, there would be ropes that would be lashed across both arms and around the torso, because they didn't want the victim to what? Didn't want him to die too quickly. Josephus and other historians chronicle some remaining on the cross for up to 5 days. There were some who died of starvation. It wasn't necessarily the blood loss from places in your because they didn't hit any vital organs. They purposely didn't want to do that, and so the victim was subjected to obviously severe heat in the summer, cold in the winter, insects. You could just imagine that it went on for days at a time. That was the purpose of it. Jesus, from the standpoint of other victims, dies rather quickly. And most scholars attribute that to the scourging, that the scourging probably weakened him to the point that he died before the two thieves did in that regard. So what's interesting about this is we read John's account here, and he's pretty, at the risk of sounding just too bland about it, he is. He presents it in a very methodical way. You need to read the other accounts to get a different perspective. Luke writes his account of the crucifixion from the perspective and through the lens of what? Yeah, as a physician. And so Luke goes into more detail about the anguish and the excruciating pain. He would know. He would know firsthand. He had a clear idea of the physiological, what was going on, during something like that. Mark, on the other hand, says very, very little about the pain and the anguish. Mark's emphasis is on what? The shame, which harkens back to the end of Mark chapter 8, the end of that exchange that Jesus had with his apostles. And the concluding statement he makes there that Mark records is, "Whosoever is ashamed of me, will my Father be ashamed." And from that point on, Mark really begins to establish the reality that sometimes following Jesus is a very shameful experience. And he has, and this is what I love about Mark as well, Mark has a very convicting way of turning on the reader and saying, okay, remember, this is part of it. This is what you signed up for, James.
Is there a quotation in the Old Testament about cursed
Yes.
is anyone who dies on a tree?
Yep, cursed is anyone that, Paul quotes that. And tree there, I've heard some interesting interpretations of that in some instances, they in fact nailed them to trees. They very well could have, but it basically was called that because of the shape. And what's interesting about crucifixion, sometimes it was in the T shape that we're accustomed to in the Christian, as a Christian symbol. In other instances, it was an X. It was kind of left up to the execution squad in that regard. But in every case, the victim was required to drag his cross from wherever, at the fortress, down the Via Dolorosa, out to the place of execution. That was part of the shame. That was part, in that regard. And then, of course, they would get to the place, and the victim is stripped and placed on the wood and, impaled to it, lashed with it, and then suspended. And the only thing, in fact, and I'm jumping ahead, but when you get to the near the end of it, they broke the legs of the two thieves in order to hasten their demise, but Jesus was already dead. And there is, in fact, there's some interesting articles about the spear that was thrust in his side and the separation of water and blood that came out together, indicating that he died of heart failure. I'm not a medical person, I don't know, but I tend to think he was already dead at that point. That obviously the spear wound didn't finish him off. He was already dead, and to what degree, does that, was it pericardial fluid? What was it? We don't know. But I tend to think it was more the weakened state that he was already in as a result of the scourging. Back up to verse 18. There they crucified him with him two others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. What does John not tell us that the synoptics tell us about these two? Okay, they were thieves, and even though under Jewish culture, theft did not carry the death penalty, under Rome, the capital offenses primarily were, they say robbery, but I think it had some bearing on what you had to have stolen something pretty significant. But the main thing that got you, executed was sedition. That was it. And the reason why they chose this was it sent a message. You want to rise up against Rome? Okay, take your best shot. Andre.
The Apocrypha sets these two up as being robbers on the road as Joseph and Mary and Jesus went to Egypt.
Really?
And that they were passing through a trail at night because they traveled at night, it was cooler.
Yeah.
And these two let them go on without raising up the rest of the robbers.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah. You look at robbers in the Gospels especially. The Good Samaritan, of course, came upon a man who fell among a, translation says, a band of robbers. You very rarely do you come across just one. They were always in groups, which seems to indicate that they were more than just pickpockets. These were gangsters. And so, yeah, these two. John doesn't record the exchange between the two with each other and with Jesus. John doesn't record that. What he does record, of course, is the fact that, and this is odd. This is odd to me because Pilate, had basically. Remember when he washed his hands? John doesn't record that, but he washes his hands. It's almost like he's through with it. But then verse 19, he wrote a title and put it on the cross. Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Now, if you're trying to stay on the good side of the Jewish leaders, what would prompt you to do that? Some believe, and here again, it's not in the text, but some believe that it was after he washed his hands and after he thought he was through with it that his wife came up to him and said, what? Leave this alone. I have had dreams about this man. That, and here again, text doesn't say anything about this, but it is interesting that he would then take it. You didn't, but did they always put a placard above the head of the victim? You don't with the other two. And of course he's called upon with that. Many of the Jews came to him and said, don't write the King of the Jews, but this man said, I am King of the Jews. Well, what's the problem with that? what had they accused him of? Sedition. So why not just leave it that way? And by the way, isn't it interesting that it's in all three languages? Hebrew, Latin, and in Greek. I wonder who wrote the Hebrew for him. I don't know that Pilate would have known Hebrew, but anybody that read it knew exactly what was going on here. Okay, we're going to put a mark here and pick up in verse 23 next week because, oddly enough, John does record the dismantling, if you will, of his what belongings he had, and then we'll press on. But thank you for being here, and we'll pick up here next week.